The Cedar Creek was more than a boundary, it was a scar. For generations, its silvered, icy ribbon had cleaved the land, a tangible manifestation of the chasm that separated Elias Rowe's people from those who lived beyond its banks, the tribe known only in hushed, fearful tones as the Hollow Sky. Elias had grown up with the ingrained certainty that the other side harbored only animosity, a truth as immutable as the turning of the seasons. This inherited animosity was a heavy cloak, woven from the whispers of his elders and the unspoken anxieties of his community. It was a story passed down, a narrative of ingrained distrust that shaped every interaction, every averted gaze, every hushed conversation about the others. The creek itself seemed to carry this burden, its currents murmuring tales of ancient grievances, its frozen surface a mirror reflecting a deeply ingrained fear. Elias, like everyone in his town, had accepted this narrative without question, its logic as natural and unquestioned as the air he breathed. Life was a cycle of quiet endurance, of maintaining the delicate, precarious balance that had been struck between two worlds that refused to acknowledge each other. Survival was the primary currency, and the shared history of animosity was the bedrock upon which their fragile peace was built. Then, one frigid spring morning, the immutable began to shift. The thaw had transformed the Cedar Creek from a silent sentinel into a raging, unpredictable force. Elias, seeking firewood along its swollen banks, heard a sound that pierced the mundane reality of his day. A high-pitched, desperate cry, a sound utterly devoid of language, yet screaming with primal terror. His gaze was drawn to the churning water, and there, caught in the unforgiving grasp of the current, was a small child. A girl, her dark hair plastered to her face, her tiny limbs flailing against the relentless pull of the water. The ingrained certainty of his world fractured in that instant. The instinct to survive, so deeply ingrained in him, was momentarily eclipsed by a more potent, more fundamental urge. He didn't think, he reacted. The icy shock of the water was a brutal embrace, the jagged stones beneath the surface a cruel caress against his skin. He fought his way towards the struggling figure, the roar of the river a deafening counterpoint to the frantic beat of his own heart. When he finally pulled her, coughing and shivering, onto the muddy bank, a profound silence descended, broken only by the girl's ragged breaths. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and an unnerving, nascent trust. And then Elias saw it. A delicate symbol etched onto a necklace around her neck, the emblem of the Hollow Sky, the enemies, the ones he had been taught to fear. Carrying the child home was an act that rippled through the quietude of his town like a stone dropped into a still pond. Every eye seemed to follow him as he crossed the main street, the small, limp form cradled in his arms. The whispers began immediately, a low hum of apprehension and judgment. Old man Henderson, his face a roadmap of ingrained prejudice, spat on the ground, his voice rough with disapproval. "You'll bring a curse down on us, Elias. You know what they are." Elias felt the weight of those words, the familiar echo of generations of fear. His wife, Clara, met his gaze from their porch, her expression a complex tapestry of apprehension and a flicker of something akin to hope. "Elias, what have you done?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. He didn't have an answer, not yet. All he knew was that a forgotten rhythm had begun to pulse within him, a beat that had nothing to do with the grim calculus of survival and everything to do with the fragile life he held. This unexpected rescue had stirred something dormant within him, a nascent feeling that transcended the boundaries of his upbringing. As night fell, a quiet revelation unfolded. The child, still weak, but her breathing steadier, stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she uttered a word, a soft sound Elias couldn't comprehend. Then, in a gesture that defied all the ingrained animosity he carried, she reached up, her small hands cupping his face. A faint smile touched her lips, a fragile bloom of pure humanity. In that moment, something shifted within Elias. It wasn't just about returning a lost child. It was about receiving something infinitely more precious. He felt a profound connection, a recognition of shared vulnerability that transcended the artificial divisions that had defined his world. This small act of kindness, offered by someone he had been conditioned to despise, was a seed of change, a quiet testament to the possibility of a different narrative. The simple touch of her hands, the gentle smile, had begun to chip away at the hardened shell of his inherited beliefs, revealing a deeper truth about connection and shared humanity. The immediate aftermath presented a stark dichotomy of choices, each fraught with peril. The town council, a collective embodiment of the prevailing fear, demanded he hand the girl over to the sheriff, a perfunctory act that would likely seal her fate within the rigid structures of their community. But the more insidious obstacle was internal, a gnawing doubt that preyed on Elias's conscience. If he returned her to her people, would he be condemning her to a future dictated by the very animosity he had been taught to uphold? Conversely, if he chose to keep her, to shield her from her own kind, would he be igniting a conflict that would consume them all? He spent the night listening to the relentless murmur of the Cedar Creek, its ceaseless flow, a somber reminder of the deep, unyielding currents of history and tradition that governed their lives. The river, in its constant movement, seemed to symbolize the unyielding nature of the feuds that had shaped their existence, a silent, impartial witness to his internal struggle. The dawn brought with it a sight that shattered the town's carefully constructed reality. The thunder of hooves announced an arrival, but it was not the arrival of law or reprisal. A procession of horses emerged from the mist, carrying figures Elias had only known as specters from fearful tales, the elders of the hollow sky. Leading them was their chief, a man whose presence commanded an ancient authority. He dismounted, and in his hands he carried not weapons, but a finely embroidered blanket, its ancient symbols speaking a language of tradition and reverence. Behind him, others bore offerings, clay pots, ceremonial arrows, a feather rattle, sacred gifts that had never before been seen in Elias's town. The silence that descended was profound, so thick with unspoken questions and a dawning sense of awe that the only sound that seemed to penetrate it was the distant, constant sigh of the Cedar Creek. This was an overture to a new possibility, a gesture that defied the established order of things and invited a reckoning with the past. The chief's words, when they finally came, were not a demand or an accusation, but a statement of profound acknowledgement. "The river has given us back what was taken from us," he declared, his voice resonating with a quiet power. "You gave us back what we never had, trust." The weight of that statement settled upon Elias, but he understood it was not solely for him. It was for the huddled figures of his town, peering from behind curtains, listening to the fragile sounds of an old narrative beginning to fracture. The chief's words were a bridge, an offering of reconciliation that extended far beyond the immediate act of returning a child. It was an invitation to see beyond the ingrained fear, to acknowledge the shared humanity that had been buried beneath layers of misunderstanding and historical grievance. The culmination of this unexpected encounter arrived with the appearance of the girl's mother. She approached Elias and, in a gesture that transcended words, knelt before him, placing the intricately embroidered blanket at his feet. It was an act of profound spiritual adoption, a formal recognition of the bond that had been forged in the icy waters of the Cedar Creek. For Elias, a man who had carried the silent ache of childlessness for years, the ground seemed to disappear beneath him. The very people he had been taught to fear, the shadows that had haunted his childhood, were now offering him a place within their circle, a sense of belonging that his own bloodline had never provided. In that humbling moment, the inherited lie that had defined his world began to unravel, revealing a truth far more profound and infinitely more hopeful. The river had indeed brought change, not just to the landscape, but to the very heart of Elias Rowe. The weight of that humble offering, the blanket at his feet, settled not as a burden, but as a profound invitation to a different kind of inheritance. Elias felt a seismic shift, a reorientation of his very identity, as the tribe's gesture of spiritual adoption bypassed the sterile formality of law and spoke directly to a deeper, more primal need within him. This wasn't a transaction of goods or services, it was an acknowledgement of shared spirit, a quiet recognition of a kinship that predated the animosity. For years, Elias had navigated life with a quiet resignation, the absence of children a silent testament to a path not taken. Now faced with this unexpected embrace from a people he had been taught to demonize, he experienced a profound sense of being seen, of being welcomed into a lineage that offered a solace far richer than any blood tie he had ever known. This moment was not about erasing the past, but about a radical reinterpretation of it, a revelation that the narratives he had been fed were incomplete, perhaps even deliberately distorted. He realized that the fear he had carried was not his own, but a borrowed burden, an ancestral debt he was now being invited to shed. Furthermore, the act of the girl's mother was not merely a personal validation for Elias. It was a potent symbol of communal reconciliation. The blanket, adorned with symbols Elias didn't fully comprehend, but instinctively felt the significance of, represented a tangible link to a shared history that had been deliberately obscured. Consider how this applies when you face a situation where a perceived enemy extends a genuine gesture of goodwill. The initial reaction might be suspicion, a conditioned response to protect oneself. However, Elias's experience underscores the transformative power of acknowledging that goodwill, of extending one's own hand in return, even when it challenges deeply ingrained beliefs. This reciprocal act of trust, initiated by the Hollow Sky Elders and now mirrored by Elias's acceptance of their offering, began to dissolve the very foundations of the town's inherited narrative of hatred. The symbolism was clear. The past was not an inescapable prison, but a complex tapestry that could be rewoven with threads of understanding and mutual respect. Building on this, the significance of the tribal gifts extended beyond the immediate emotional impact on Elias. The clay pots and ceremonial arrows, items steeped in the traditions of the Hollow Sky people, represented not just a peace offering, but a sharing of their cultural essence. It was an act of vulnerability, a willingness to reveal their identity to those who had only ever perceived them through a distorted lens of fear. For Elias, this was a profound lesson in the nature of true understanding. It wasn't enough to simply cease hostilities. Genuine connection required an openness to learn, to appreciate, and to integrate the richness of another's heritage. This encounter forced Elias to confront the superficiality of his town's perception of the Hollow Sky, revealing that their otherness was not a fundamental flaw, but a rich tapestry of tradition and resilience that had been deliberately hidden. The gifts were an invitation to look deeper, to see the humanity that had been masked by generations of manufactured animosity. Conversely, the quiet dignity with which these gifts were presented stood in stark contrast to the boisterous pronouncements of his own town's elders. Their fear-driven narratives, amplified by years of unchallenged rhetoric, seemed hollow and brittle in the face of the Hollow Sky's sincere outreach. Elias recognized that the animosity he had grown up with was not an inherent truth, but a constructed narrative, a deliberate act of omission and misdirection designed to maintain a specific social order. The inherited lie, as he now understood it, was a powerful tool of control, and his town had been its willing, albeit unwitting, participant. The act of spiritual adoption was thus not just a personal revelation for Elias, but a pivotal moment in challenging the collective delusion that had held his community captive. It was a quiet defiance, a personal act of liberation that had the potential to resonate far beyond his own life. The profound realization that the town's animosity was an inherited lie, a carefully constructed narrative rather than an intrinsic truth, presented Elias with his most significant internal hurdle yet. This wasn't merely about changing his mind. It was about dismantling the very framework of his identity, a process that felt akin to navigating a minefield blindfolded. The tangible proof that drawing in his father's notebook, depicting the same symbol as Sahi's necklace, served as irrefutable evidence. The story of his great-grandfather's salvation by the hollow sky during a devastating famine and the subsequent deliberate erasure and distortion of this history to mask a debt laid bare the calculated deception at the heart of his community's ingrained prejudice. Everything he had believed, every fearful story he had absorbed, crumbled under the weight of this revelation. The barrier between their peoples wasn't rooted in cultural incompatibility or inherent difference, but in a deliberate, generational act of falsehood. This understanding placed an immense responsibility upon him, demanding a conscious effort to unlearn decades of ingrained suspicion and to forge a new path based on a truth that had been systematically buried. Now consider how this applies when you confront a deeply ingrained personal bias. Perhaps it stems from a childhood experience, a piece of misinformation passed down from family, or a societal echo that has become internalized. The moment of clarity, much like Elias finding the drawing, often arrives unexpectedly, shattering the comfortable edifice of your preconceived notions. It might be an encounter with someone you've been conditioned to distrust, whose actions or words reveal a complexity that defies the simplistic caricature you've held. The challenge then becomes not just to acknowledge this new information, but to actively work towards shedding the old, to consciously dismantle the mental architecture built on falsehoods. This requires a deliberate and often uncomfortable process of self-examination, a willingness to question deeply held assumptions and to embrace the cognitive dissonance that arises when reality starkly contradicts deeply ingrained beliefs. It's about recognizing that the enemy you've been taught to fear might, in fact, be a fellow traveler, similarly shaped by narratives beyond their control. Furthermore, the second obstacle Elias faced was the daunting task of confronting his own town after the elders had departed, leaving him to navigate the immediate fallout. The pivotal moment arrived when Henderson approached him, not with the expected fury or condemnation, but with a look Elias had never seen directed at him before: shame. Henderson's admission, "You shamed us, Elias, and maybe you saved us," was a powerful indictment of the town's collective blindness, a tacit acknowledgement of their moral failing. This wasn't a triumphant victory for Elias, but a somber recognition of the immense task ahead. The seeds of change had been sown, but the harvest would require immense communal effort. The weight of this revelation was immense, carrying with it the understanding that his personal journey of discovery had now intersected with a broader societal reckoning. He had not only saved a child, but he had also inadvertently illuminated the deep-seated rot of a fabricated history, forcing his community to confront the uncomfortable truth of their own complicity. This situation mirrors instances where an individual's courageous act of truth-telling forces a community or organization to confront its own systemic injustices. Think of whistleblowers who expose corruption, or activists who bring hidden abuses to light. Their actions, often met with initial resistance and ostracization, ultimately serve as catalysts for change. Henderson's shame was not an isolated emotion. It represented the collective unease of a community beginning to recognize the moral bankruptcy of its foundational beliefs. Elias's courage had provided the external impetus, the undeniable evidence that allowed this internal reckoning to begin. The path forward for such communities is rarely smooth. It involves grappling with denial, defensiveness, and the arduous process of rebuilding trust. However, it is through such painful confrontations that genuine transformation can occur, moving from a state of perpetuating harmful narratives to one of actively seeking truth and reconciliation. The act of saving a child had, in essence, saved his people from the suffocating grip of a story that was never theirs to carry, a narrative of hatred that had served only to perpetuate a cycle of division. The weight of that humble offering, the blanket at his feet, settled not as a burden, but as a profound invitation to a different kind of inheritance. Elias felt a seismic shift, a reorientation of his very identity, as the tribe's gesture of spiritual adoption bypassed the sterile formality of law and spoke directly to a deeper, more primal need within him. This wasn't a transaction of goods or services, it was an acknowledgement of shared spirit, a quiet recognition of a kinship that predated the animosity. For years, Elias had navigated life with a quiet resignation, the absence of children a silent testament to a path not taken. Now faced with this unexpected embrace from a people he had been taught to demonize, he experienced a profound sense of being seen, of being welcomed into a lineage that offered a solace far richer than any blood tie he had ever known. This moment was not about erasing the past, but about a radical reinterpretation of it, a revelation that the narratives he had been fed were incomplete, perhaps even deliberately distorted. He realized that the fear he had carried was not his own, but a borrowed burden, an ancestral debt he was now being invited to shed. Furthermore, the act of the girl's mother was not merely a personal validation for Elias. It was a potent symbol of communal reconciliation. The blanket, adorned with symbols Elias didn't fully comprehend, but instinctively felt the significance of, represented a tangible link to a shared history that had been deliberately obscured. Consider how this applies when you face a situation where a perceived enemy extends a genuine gesture of goodwill. The initial reaction might be suspicion, a conditioned response to protect oneself. Elias's experience underscores the transformative power of acknowledging that goodwill, of extending one's own hand in return, even when it challenges deeply ingrained beliefs. This reciprocal act of trust, initiated by the Hollow Sky Elders and now mirrored by Elias's acceptance of their offering, began to dissolve the very foundations of the town's inherited narrative of hatred. The symbolism was clear. The past was not an inescapable prison, but a complex tapestry that could be rewoven with threads of understanding and mutual respect. Building on this, the significance of the tribal gifts extended beyond the immediate emotional impact on Elias. The clay pots and ceremonial arrows, items steeped in the traditions of the Hollow Sky people, represented not just a peace offering, but a sharing of their cultural essence. It was an act of vulnerability, a willingness to reveal their identity to those who had only ever perceived them through a distorted lens of fear. For Elias, this was a profound lesson in the nature of true understanding. It wasn't enough to simply cease hostilities. Genuine connection required an openness to learn, to appreciate, and to integrate the richness of another's heritage. This encounter forced Elias to confront the superficiality of his town's perception of the Hollow Sky, revealing that their otherness was not a fundamental flaw, but a rich tapestry of tradition and resilience that had been deliberately hidden. The gifts were an invitation to look deeper, to see the humanity that had been masked by generations of manufactured animosity. Conversely, the quiet dignity with which these gifts were presented stood in stark contrast to the boisterous pronouncements of his own town's elders. Their fear-driven narratives, amplified by years of unchallenged rhetoric, seemed hollow and brittle in the face of the Hollow Sky's sincere outreach. Elias recognized that the animosity he had grown up with was not an inherent truth, but a constructed narrative, a deliberate act of omission and misdirection designed to maintain a specific social order. The inherited lie, as he now understood it, was a powerful tool of control, and his town had been its willing, albeit unwitting, participant. The act of spiritual adoption was thus not just a personal revelation for Elias, but a pivotal moment in challenging the collective delusion that had held his community captive. It was a quiet defiance, a personal act of liberation that had the potential to resonate far beyond his own life. Consequently, the revelation of his great-grandfather's debt and the subsequent fabrication of history by his own town underscored the chilling reality that narratives of hatred are often meticulously crafted to serve specific, often selfish agendas. This wasn't a spontaneous eruption of animosity, but a calculated suppression of truth, a deliberate act of manipulation designed to perpetuate a cycle of fear and division. The very foundation of his community's identity was built upon a deliberate distortion of the past, a betrayal of historical accuracy that had cost generations their potential for genuine connection. Elias's discovery of the notebook entry was, in essence, an unearthing of buried evidence, a forensic examination of his community's collective psyche that revealed a profound betrayal of trust. Reflecting on this journey so far, we see the intricate weaving of personal awakening against the backdrop of deeply entrenched communal memory. The currents of the Cedar Creek, once a stark division, now carry the echoes of a profound internal thaw. The weight of inherited narratives, so often accepted as immutable truths, has begun to yield under the persistent pressure of witnessed humanity. The fragile gestures of connection, initially met with apprehension, have bloomed into a testament to the resilience of empathy, demonstrating how a single act of courage can ripple outwards, challenging the very foundations of long-held animosities. The landscape itself, once a symbol of division, is being subtly redrawn, not by decree, but by the quiet, undeniable force of a shared awakening. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider the way in which individual acts of courage, born from moments of profound vulnerability, can illuminate the path through generations of ingrained misunderstanding. The intricate tapestry of a community's identity is not static. It is a living, breathing entity capable of being rewoven thread by painstaking thread. The raw, unvarnished truth, once uncovered, possesses a potent transformative energy, capable of dismantling the carefully constructed walls of fear and suspicion that have long dictated communal interactions. This process is not about forgetting the past, but about understanding its complexities, about recognizing how narratives, whether born of genuine grievance or deliberate manipulation, shape our present and dictate our future. The subtle shift in perception, the dawning realization that the other is not an abstract concept but a living, breathing individual, marks a crucial turning point in this ongoing evolution. Drawing these strands together, we observe how the erosion of deeply held biases is not a singular event, but a gradual unfolding, much like the slow, persistent work of a river reshaping its banks. The initial shock of confronting a fabricated history gives way to a more nuanced understanding of how such falsehoods are perpetuated and the profound impact they have on intergenerational relationships. The courage required to embrace a truth that contradicts deeply ingrained beliefs is immense, yet it is precisely this courage that unlocks the potential for genuine reconciliation and healing. The insights gained from witnessing unexpected acts of kindness and the subsequent willingness to reciprocate, even in the face of deep-seated skepticism, pave the way for a future where bridges can be built across divides that once seemed insurmountable. The cumulative effect of these experiences is a quiet but powerful redefinition of what it means to belong, to connect, and to understand. Cedar Creek, once a stark symbol of division, now flows as a testament to a different kind of current, one that carries understanding rather than animosity. The deep-seated distrust that had etched itself into the very landscape of Elias's world began to dissolve not with grand pronouncements, but with the quiet, undeniable power of human connection. The narrative of hatred, so meticulously constructed and so readily accepted, proved to be a brittle edifice, its foundations exposed by the simple, profound act of saving a child. Elias's journey, from a man bound by inherited fear to one who had witnessed the transformative potential of empathy, illuminated a critical truth. The stories we tell ourselves and are told about others can be far more potent than any physical barrier. The revelation of his family's history, intertwined with the deliberate distortion of truth by his own community, underscored the insidious nature of fabricated narratives and the immense responsibility that comes with uncovering and challenging them. The shame that flickered in Henderson's eyes was not merely a personal failing, but a collective awakening, a dawning realization that the comfortable certainty of their shared animosity was built upon a foundation of deliberate deception. It was the initial tremor of a seismic shift, the moment when the weight of an inherited lie became too heavy to bear. Elias's courage in the face of this ingrained prejudice was not a solitary act of defiance, but a catalyst, an illumination that allowed others to begin questioning the narratives that had long governed their lives. The gifts exchanged, the tentative gestures of trust offered by the Hollow Sky Elders, represented not just a cessation of hostilities, but a powerful invitation to rebuild, to forge a new understanding rooted in shared humanity rather than manufactured fear. The spiritual adoption, the acceptance of a lineage that transcended blood, spoke volumes about the possibility of finding family in the most unexpected places, of redefining belonging not by the accident of birth, but by the deliberate choice to connect and to care. The true impact of Elias's experience lies not in the dramatic rescue itself, but in the profound internal transformation it ignited. It demonstrated that the most formidable barriers are often not those etched in the land, but those constructed within the mind, reinforced by generations of unchallenged prejudice. The moment the ice broke, not just in the river, but within Elias himself, symbolized the shattering of deeply ingrained beliefs and the emergence of a more compassionate perspective. The river, once a symbol of division, had become a conduit for healing, its waters carrying the potential for renewal. The girl, Sahi, now a familiar presence, a thread woven into the fabric of his daily life, served as a constant, quiet reminder that the stories we are given are not necessarily the truths we must carry. The true practice begins now in the everyday moments, in the willingness to extend grace, to question assumptions, and to recognize the shared humanity that binds us all, even across the widest of perceived divides. The legacy of Cedar Creek is not one of conquered animosity, but of the quiet, persistent power of understanding to transform the currents of history.